The dust in Six Wells, Arizona territory, was a language all its own. In the year of our Lord, 1879, it spoke of a long, cruel thirst. It was the color of old blood, a fine red powder that settled on every hat brim, coated every throat, and painted streaks on the faces of men who had forgotten the feel of a real rain. The town itself was little more than a handful of sun-beaten buildings huddled together as if for comfort, anchored to the scorched earth by the 6 deep wells that gave it its name and its life. Each well was a god, and the creak of its bucket rope was the only prayer that mattered. From the window of her newly established print shop, the 6 Wells Ledger, Abigail Moreau watched the town's gods hold court. She had arrived 2 months prior, a widow with little to her name but a heavy printing press, a crate of lead type, and a quiet determination that the desert sun had not yet managed to bake out of her. Her husband, a kind man with a weak heart, had left her with a love for the written word and the knowledge that truth, like water, was a commodity people would kill for in a dry land. Six Wells was a very dry land. Its temporal power resided not at the bottom of a well, but in the sprawling ranchlands of Roman Vale, a man whose shadow stretched farther than any butte on the horizon. His cattle drank first, and what was left over trickled down to the town, a generosity measured and controlled. His law was Sheriff Pike, a man whose badge was less a symbol of justice and more a token of convenience. His posture permanently settled into a comfortable slouch against the porch post of his office. Abigail, however, was more interested in the town's mythology. She had already identified its 6 central figures, the men the town looked to, for better or worse. She called them, in the privacy of her own mind, the heroes of Six Wells. There was Dr. Elias Cho, his movements as precise and sterile as his instruments. He was a beacon of science in a world governed by superstition and raw force. Then came Ben Hollis, the blacksmith. His arms were thick as tree limbs from swinging his hammer, his silence as heavy and solid as the anvils he worked upon. He was the town's foundation, its brute strength. Reverend Stone presided over the small wooden church, his sermons filled with fire and brimstone, though his eyes held a cool, calculating patience that seemed at odds with his passionate words. Jack Virio was a different sort of pillar, one who thrived in the smoky haze of the saloon. He was a gambler whose currency was charm and whose luck was legendary, a man who could strip a man of his last dollar and make him feel fortunate for the experience. Then there were the sons, inheritors of power. Deputy Caleb Pike, the sheriff's boy, wore his father's authority like an ill-fitting coat, all swagger and sharp glances, his hand always hovering near the Colt at his hip. And finally, Dane Vale, Roman's heir, who rode into town with the restless energy of a man who owned everything he saw but was satisfied by none of it. These 6 men were the heart of her first big feature story. They were the engine of Six Wells, and Abigail meant to understand what made them run. That was why she was walking toward the livery stable, a notepad in her hand, the afternoon sun hot on the back of her neck. She was to interview the owner about the new line of horses brought in from the east. The stable smelled of hay, worn leather, and the warm, earthy scent of animals. It was a drowsy, peaceful place in the heat of the day. Abigail was in a back stall, admiring a handsome bay mare, when the first wisp of smoke curled under the door. She thought little of it, perhaps a smith's fire from nearby. Then a thicker, acrid cloud followed. The horses grew restless, their whinnies sharp with alarm. When she turned, a wall of orange flame was consuming the far end of the stable, eating through the dry timber with a hungry roar. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. The smoke was a choking blanket, stealing the air from her lungs. Her eyes burned, and the world dissolved into a terrifying, hazy inferno. She stumbled toward the main entrance, but the fire was faster, a living beast that cut off her path. The roar grew louder, the heat so intense it felt as if it were melting her skin. She fell to her knees, coughing, the notepad slipping from her grasp. Through the swirling black smoke, she saw the main doors, a rectangle of hope, now framed by a horrifying arch of fire. She was trapped. This was how it would end, not in a quiet bed, but in ash and smoke in a forgotten corner of the Arizona Territory. Just as her consciousness began to fray, a shape materialized in the doorway. It was not one of the 6 men she'd been studying. This figure was lean, moving with a fluid grace that defied the chaos around him. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. Strong hands gripped her arms, pulling her up with an astonishing, effortless strength. He wrapped a piece of cloth, torn from his own shirt, around her nose and mouth. He guided her low to the ground, his body a shield against the blistering heat. His presence was a bubble of calm in the roaring storm. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back as he half carried, half dragged her toward an escape she could no longer see. They burst through a side door she had not known was there, collapsing onto the dusty ground outside as the stable's roof groaned and then fell inward with a deafening crash. Abigail lay gasping for air, the blessed, clean air filling her lungs. Her rescuer was already on his feet, his back to her, ensuring no one else was inside. She saw him for only a moment against the backdrop of the flames, a Navajo man, his dark hair tied back, his features etched with a quiet intensity. Then, as the townspeople began to shout and run toward the fire, he simply melted away into the confusion, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. By nightfall, the livery stable was a smoldering ruin, and Abigail Moreau was the toast of 6 wells. She sat in Dr. Cho's office, a blanket around her shoulders, sipping a glass of water while the doctor pronounced her lucky to be alive, with nothing more than singed hair and a raw throat. It was then that the heroes began to arrive. Caleb Pike was first, chest puffed out. "Saw the smoke from my father's office," he announced to the small crowd that had gathered. "Ran right in, plucked her out just as the roof was coming down. Another second and we both would have been goners." He had barely finished his tale when Dane Vale appeared, dusting off his fine leather jacket. "Caleb has a flair for the dramatic," he said with a dismissive smile. "I was the one who kicked down the side door. He merely helped me carry her the last few feet. It was nothing, really." Soon, Ben Hollis stood awkwardly in the doorway, his face smudged with soot. He muttered something about seeing the flames from his forge and running to help, nodding grimly when others clapped him on the back. Reverend Stone arrived to offer a prayer of thanks, subtly implying that his own hands, guided by the Lord, had been instrumental in pulling Abigail from the jaws of death. Even Jack Virio, leaning against the doorframe, dealt himself into the narrative. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he said with a wry grin. "Let us be honest. It was a team effort. I distracted the flames with a bit of fancy footwork, while these strong fellows did the heavy lifting." Abigail, still dazed, could not make sense of it. She remembered a single figure, a single pair of strong hands, yet here were all 6 of them, the pillars of the community, weaving a collective tapestry of heroism. She was exhausted, grateful to be alive, and in no position to question the men who were being hailed as her saviors. She offered her thanks, her voice a hoarse whisper, and allowed the town to celebrate its heroes. The next morning, the sun rose on a town buzzing with the story. The 6 Wells Ledger had its headline, but something felt wrong. The memory of her rescue was a blur of smoke and fear. Yet the one clear image was of a quiet, determined face that belonged to none of the men who had taken the credit. Driven by an instinct she could not name, Abigail returned to the ruins of the stable. The air was thick with the smell of charred wood and wet ash. She walked the perimeter of the disaster, her journalistic mind trying to piece together the sequence of events. She was searching for her notepad, hoping it might have miraculously survived, when her foot struck something small and hard in the blackened dirt. She knelt down, brushing away the soot. It was a silver earring. It was not a woman's delicate bauble. This was heavier, crafted with a distinct masculine artistry. A single piece of sky-blue turquoise was set in hammered silver, surrounded by finely stamped lines that radiated outward like sunbeams. It was beautiful, solid, and undeniably the work of a master craftsman. Abigail held it in her palm. She had seen work like this before. On the edge of town, far from the main street, was a small, unassuming adobe where a Navajo silversmith lived and worked. His name, she had been told, was Ani. He kept to himself, trading his exquisite silverwork for supplies, his interactions with the townsfolk brief and formal. She had once stopped to admire a bracelet he was selling at the general store, struck by the same powerful, clean lines, the same deep respect for the stone and the metal. The earring felt warm in her hand, a small, solid piece of the truth. The man who had pulled her from the fire, Ani. He had not come forward. He had not boasted or claimed any reward. He had simply acted and then vanished. While the 6 heroes of 6 wells were accepting the town's adulation, her true rescuer remained silent, invisible. Back in her print shop, the smell of ink a comforting familiarity, Abigail stood before the empty frame of her next edition. The story the town expected her to write was simple: 6 town heroes save widow from fiery demise. It was a story that would sell papers and solidify her place in the community. It would please Roman Vale, Sheriff Pike, and all their powerful associates. She opened her hand and looked at the silver earring lying in her palm. Its intricate design was not a boast. It was a statement of identity, a truth etched in metal. It told a different story, a quieter one, about a courage that did not need an audience. It spoke of a gentle soul who acted not for glory, but because it was the right thing to do. Abigail closed her fingers around the earring. The lead type for the headline felt cold and heavy in her other hand. She could print the lie, the easy story that everyone wanted to hear, or she could honor the silent truth she now held. She looked out the window at the dusty street, at the town living under the shadow of its loud, celebrated heroes. She put the type down. She would not write their story today. She would not print their names. The front page of the 6 Wells ledger could wait. First, she had to find the truth. A truth that began not with a roar, but with a whisper of hammered silver. The walk to the edge of 6 Wells was a journey from one world to another. The main street, with its saloon chatter and the steady clang of Ben Hollis's hammer, faded behind Abigail. Here, the dust settled differently. The silence was deeper, punctuated only by the whisper of the wind through brittle sagebrush. Ani's adobe was small, blending into the dun-colored landscape as if it had grown from the earth itself. There was no sign, no welcome. Only a thin curl of smoke rising from a chimney pipe gave any indication of life within. He was outside, working in the sliver of shade offered by the building's overhang. He was not hammering silver, but mending a leather saddle strap, his movements economical and precise. A small forge stood nearby, its coals glowing with a patient, orange heart. Tools lay neatly arranged on a hide-cloth hammers of varying sizes, chisels, stamps, all worn smooth by use. He did not look up as she approached, yet she knew he was aware of her every footstep. The desert had taught him to listen with his entire being. Abigail stopped a few feet away, her own shadow stretching long and thin in the morning light. She held out her hand, palm up. The silver earring lay against her skin, its turquoise stone a startling splash of color against the endless brown of the desert. "I believe this is yours," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I found it. At the livery." He finally looked up. His eyes were dark and held a profound stillness, like the water at the bottom of a deep well. There was no surprise in his gaze, no flicker of denial or confirmation. He simply looked from the earring to her face and then back to his work, his hands resuming their methodical task of stitching the thick leather. "The fire was hot," he said, his voice low and even. more a statement of fact than a part of a conversation. Yes, Abigail agreed. It was. She waited, but he offered nothing more. The silence stretched, filled by the scrape of his awl through the leather. The town seems to believe there were 6 heroes that day. He paused his work for a moment, his hands resting on the saddle strap. He looked out toward the distant mesas, his profile sharp against the pale sky. A man's kindness needs no signature, he said softly. Not to her, but to the vast, empty space before him. He did not claim the deed. He did not want the earring back. He had answered her question without answering it at all, confirming the truth by refusing to engage with the town's lie. He had placed the responsibility for that truth squarely in her hands. Abigail understood. To press him further would be a violation of the quiet dignity he so clearly valued. She closed her fingers around the earring. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His attention already returned to the intricate work before him. As she walked away, the sound of his steady, rhythmic stitching was the only farewell. The town, however, was not nearly so quiet. Her visit to the Navajo silversmith, witnessed by a mule skinner heading out of town, became a seed. By noon, it had sprouted into a thorny vine of rumor that wrapped itself around the general store, the post office, and the saloon. Abigail Moreau, the new widow, the respectable newspaper woman, was spending her mornings calling on the Navajo. When she walked to the mercantile for supplies, conversations would drop to a murmur. Women would pull their children a little closer. Men would watch her from under the brims of their hats, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. The word used in their whispers was always the same: infatuated. They spoke it as if it were a sickness, a peculiar madness brought on by smoke inhalation and loneliness. Then the heroes began their campaign. It was not a coordinated assault, but a series of individual sorties, each man employing his own particular brand of charm or influence. Their shared goal, however, was clear: to claim the woman they had supposedly saved and pull her back into the town's fold, away from the silent man on its fringe. Deputy Caleb Pike was the first to make his move. He appeared at her print shop one afternoon, leaning against the door frame, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Just making my rounds." "Miss Morrow," he said, his smile thin and possessive. "A town like this can be a dangerous place for a woman on her own. You ought to know you have the law's protection." His offer felt less like a comfort and more like a warning. Dane Vale's approach was coated in gold. He sent a boy over from the saloon with a bottle of French wine and a note inviting her to his father's ranch for a private dinner. "I will give you a tour." The note read, "An exclusive story for your paper, perhaps. We should celebrate your good fortune." He was offering her access, a taste of the power that came with the Vale name. The gestures from Dr. Cho and Ben Hollis were of a different sort. The doctor stopped her on the street, his expression one of genuine concern. He inquired about her cough and pressed a small volume of poetry into her hands. "For quiet evenings," he said gently, "the mind needs to heal, just as the body does." There were no strings attached, no expectation in his eyes. The next morning, Abigail found a beautifully crafted iron trivet on her doorstep, its surface smoothed and blackened. A simple, sturdy thing of quiet usefulness. She knew without asking that it was from Ben Hollis, a man who spoke with his hands rather than his mouth. Reverend Stone paid her a formal visit, his Bible held tightly in his hands. He spoke of gratitude and divine providence, but his gaze was sharp with judgment. He cautioned her about the company she kept, about the difference between a Christian soul and a heathen one. His concern was a cage disguised as a blessing. Jack Vireo, true to his nature, tried to dazzle her. He caught her outside the telegraph office, tipping his hat with a gambler's flourish. "Miss Morrow," he said, his eyes twinkling, "you have survived fire. Now you must survive the much greater danger of boredom. Allow me to teach you how to play a proper hand of poker this evening. It is a far more honest game than the one being played for your attention." Abigail navigated this sudden flood of attention with a polite but firm reserve. She accepted the doctor's book and the blacksmith's trivet with sincere thanks. She politely declined the dinner, the protection, the sermon, and the card game. Each refusal was a small act of defiance, a quiet assertion of her independence. But in a town as small as 6 Wells, such acts were never truly quiet. They were noticed, they were discussed, and they were reported. Sheriff Pike did not bother with pleasantries. He caught her as she was locking up her shop for the evening. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet, a deliberate, ugly gesture. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low drawl. "This is a good town, a quiet town. We all get along because we know our place. We do not go stirring up mud just to see what is at the bottom of the pond." "I am not stirring anything, Sheriff," Abigail replied, keeping her voice even. "I'm simply living my life." "Your life," he said, taking a step closer, "is starting to make other folks' lives uncomfortable. My boy and the Veil boy, they are good men. The whole town thinks so. It is not wise to make them look foolish. It is best to let sleeping dogs lie, especially when they are guarding your own front porch." He tapped the brim of his hat and ambled away, leaving his threat hanging in the air like the dust he had disturbed. The next day, the pressure took a new form, one that struck at the heart of her livelihood. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the general store, came to see her, his face a mask of apology. "Abigail, I'm afraid I have to pull my advertisement from the ledger," he said, refusing to meet her eyes. "Times are tight." Abigail knew Henderson's business was the most prosperous in town. She also knew he rented his building from Roman Vale. "I see," she said quietly. Later that afternoon, the livery, already being rebuilt with Vale money, also canceled its weekly notice. The economic vice was tightening. Roman Vale could not order her to print what he wanted, but he could ensure that she could not afford to print anything at all. He was trying to starve her voice into silence. That evening, a profound sense of isolation settled over her. The 6 heroes, with their competing claims and suffocating attention, were a manifestation of the town's will. They wanted to own her story, to absorb her into their narrative. Ki Nataani, in his silence, had given her a gift far more valuable than a dramatic rescue. He had given her the truth and the freedom to choose what to do with it, but that freedom was proving to be a heavy and dangerous burden. As she sat in the deepening twilight of her shop, the familiar scent of ink and paper doing little to soothe her, she stared out the window at the dusty street. She felt trapped, a single woman caught in the slow, grinding gears of a town run by powerful men. She was contemplating the wisdom of her own quiet rebellion when she saw movement in the alleyway across from the church. 2 figures emerged from the shadows. Even in the dim light, their silhouettes were unmistakable. One was Reverend Stone, his posture rigid and sanctimonious. The other was a larger, more imposing man, a man who moved with the unshakable certainty of someone who owned the very ground he stood on. It was Roman Vale. They spoke for several minutes, their heads close together. Abigail could not hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. This was not a casual conversation between a rancher and his pastor. It was a meeting of allies, a conspiracy cloaked in piety and darkness. At the end of it, Vale clasped the Reverend's shoulder, and the 2 men parted, melting back into the shadows from which they had come. A cold certainty washed over Abigail. The fire, the 6 heroes, the warnings, the financial pressure, they were all connected, all part of a larger design she could not yet see. The Reverend's secret meeting with Vale was a key, a piece that locked the others into place. This was not just about a stolen moment of glory. It was about power. It was about control. And the fire, she suspected with a growing dread, was not an accident. She looked down at her hands, at the ink stains on her fingers. Her press stood silent in the corner, a hulking mass of iron and potential. Sheriff Pike had warned her not to stir the mud. Roman Vale was trying to dry up her well. But they had misjudged her. They thought she was a grieving widow seeking safety. They did not understand that she was a journalist who had just found the scent of the most important story of her life. Her fear did not vanish, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, clear resolve. She would not be silenced. She would not be starved out. She would find out who set that fire, and why. She would take the unsigned truth she had learned from a quiet silversmith and give it a voice that would be heard all the way from the dusty streets of Six Wells to the halls of territorial justice. She would print it on paper, in bold black ink, for all to see. Abigail knew she could not understand the fight for Six Wells by staying within its dusty confines. The story of the town was not in the saloon or the church. It was in the land itself, in the secret places where water still seeped from the rock and life clung to the earth with a stubborn persistence. To understand the stakes of Roman Vale's ambition, she had to understand what he sought to control, and for that, she needed a guide. She approached Ki Nat Ani not with a notepad and a list of questions, but with a simple, honest request. She found him grinding turquoise into fine powder for inlay work. "I want to see where the water comes from," she said, without preamble. "Not the wells, the real water, the water the land remembers." He did not stop his work, his hands moving in a slow, circular motion. He understood her meaning immediately. She was not asking for a tour. She was asking for knowledge. She wanted to write about the Navajo people not as curiosities or problems, but as a people whose lives were inextricably woven into the fabric of the territory, a people who knew its deepest secrets. He considered her for a long moment, his dark eyes weighing her sincerity. He had seen the way the town treated her, the pressures they applied. He saw in her a quiet strength that mirrored the resilience of the desert plants. He gave a single, slow nod. "Tomorrow," he said, "at sunrise." They left before the town was fully awake, two small figures moving out into the vast, silent expanse of the desert. Abigail rode a sturdy mule borrowed from a sympathetic freight hauler. Ki walked, his steps so light and sure they seemed to make no sound at all. He carried little more than a water skin and a long-bladed knife. He was not a visitor in this landscape. He was a part of it. He led her away from the familiar wagon ruts and into a maze of sun-baked canyons and dry washes. The world became a place of stone and sky. Towering saguaros stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in a timeless prayer. He taught her as they traveled, not with lectures, but with quiet observations. He showed her how to read the tracks of a sidewinder in the sand, how to find the shade side of a rock where the morning moisture might still cling, how a certain type of lichen on a cliff face meant water was somewhere deep within the stone. Abigail, the scholar, the woman of letters, felt her academic knowledge shrivel under the relentless sun. Out here, a line of poetry was worth less than a mouthful of water. She filled her notebook with sketches of plants, with the Navajo words for different types of rock, with observations about the delicate, interconnected web of life that thrived in this seemingly barren world. She was learning a new language, one written in shadow, stone, and survival. They were deep in a narrow stone alley, the walls rising up on either side of them like the nave of a great, natural cathedral. When Ki suddenly stopped, he held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening. Abigail listened too, but heard only the faint, ever-present whisper of the wind. "What is it?" she asked. "The birds are gone," he said, "and the lizards, they are all in their holes." He pointed to the sky, which was no longer a brilliant, cloudless blue, but had taken on a hazy, yellowish tint. The wind is changing its song. He was right. The gentle sighing had been replaced by a low, mournful hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep in her bones. Before she could ask another question, the world went mad. A wall of brown dust, 1,000 feet high, appeared at the mouth of the canyon, roaring toward them like an angry god. It was not a storm, It was an erasure, a solid thing that was about to swallow them whole. Here, Key's voice was sharp, cutting through her paralysis. He pulled her toward a deep recess in the canyon wall, a hollow space behind a massive slab of fallen rock that leaned against the cliff. He pushed her inside, into the cramped darkness, and then crowded in behind her, his body a solid barrier at the entrance. He pulled a cloth from around his neck and pressed it into her hand. Breathe through this. The sandstorm hit with the force of a physical blow. The world outside their small sanctuary became a screaming, howling chaos. The air grew thick and dark, and the sound was deafening, a relentless shriek of wind and sand that felt as if it would tear the very rocks apart. Sand, fine as flour, found its way into every crack and crevice, a gritty, invasive presence. Abigail huddled in the back of the small cave, the cloth Key had given her pressed to her face. The scent of him, of sage and clean earth, a strange comfort in the terrifying darkness. He said nothing. He simply stood, his back to the storm, a silent, unmoving shield. Through the long hours that followed, Abigail learned the meaning of his lesson to listen with your bones. She could feel the vibration of the storm through the rock at her back. She could feel the subtle shifts in pressure as the wind gusted and eddied. In the heart of the maelstrom, there was a strange, terrifying intimacy. They were two living beings, their breaths mingling in the small, dark space, their survival dependent on a single slab of ancient stone and the wisdom of a man who knew how to listen to the earth. When it was finally over, the silence was as sudden and shocking as the noise had been. The wind died, and the world outside was still. When Key moved aside, the light that filtered in was soft, diffuse, painting the canyon in muted shades of orange and pink. The world had been remade, scoured clean by the wind. Every surface was coated in a fresh layer of fine sand. They emerged, stiff and thirsty, into the transformed landscape. Key immediately began scanning the ground, his eyes sharp. He walked to a place where the base of the canyon wall was now swept bare of its usual debris. A dark, damp patch stained the rock. He knelt and began to dig with his hands, scooping away the sand. After a few inches, clear water began to seep into the depression he had made. It was a spring, a secondary pulse of life hidden beneath the surface, revealed by the storm. It was a miracle. They drank deeply, the cool, clean water a balm to their raw throats. It was the land's apology for its fury, a gift of survival. This small, secret seep was a lifeline, a promise of hope in a land that was slowly dying of thirst. As Key refilled their water skins, Abigail's gaze wandered over the newly cleaned rock face. Her eyes, now trained to see the small details, caught something that was out of place. It was a metal stake, driven into a crack in the rock about 20 feet up the canyon wall. It looked like a landmarker, a claim stake, but it was wrong. All the official territorial markers she had seen were made of wood, with carved inscriptions. This one was iron, and it was freshly placed, the rock around it still showing signs of recent chipping. More than that, it was on the wrong side of the wash. According to the maps in the territorial office, this entire canyon system was designated as Navajo land. "Key," she said, pointing. "What is that?" He followed her gaze, and his face, usually so impassive, hardened. He walked over to the spot and studied the stake, the angle of the sun, the landmarks on the canyon rim. "It is a lie," he said, his voice flat and cold. "The line is a mile to the east. This stake is a thief." A thief. It was the perfect word. Roman Vale was not just trying to squeeze the town's water supply. He was secretly moving the very boundaries of the earth, preparing to steal the hidden springs, the lifeblood of the Navajo, right out from under them. The fire at the livery was not an isolated act of intimidation. It was a piece of a much larger, more monstrous plan. The journey back to Six Wells was a quiet one. The shared danger and the secret discovery had forged a new bond between them, a silent understanding that went deeper than words. They were no longer just a journalist and her guide. They were partners, keepers of a dangerous truth. They arrived just after dusk, hoping to slip back into town unnoticed. But Sheriff Pike was waiting for them, slouched on the porch of her print shop, a smug look on his face. He was not alone. His son, Caleb, stood beside him, his hand resting on his gun. "Enjoying your little adventure, ma'am," the sheriff drawled, his eyes flicking from her to Key with open contempt. "Exploring the wilderness with your new friend." "I was researching an article on native flora." "Sheriff," Abigail said, her voice betraying none of the fear that was coiling in her stomach. "Is that so?" Pike pushed himself off the porch rail. "Well, it just so happens that Mr. Vale lodged a complaint. Says you were trespassing on his new grazing lease. Says this man." He jerked his chin toward Key. "Was leading you onto private property." "That's impossible," Abigail shot back. "According to the territorial maps." "The maps do not matter," Pike interrupted, stepping into her path. "What matters is the complaint. And what matters is this." He snatched the notebook from her saddlebag. He flipped through the pages, his lips curling in a sneer at her sketches and notes. "This is evidence. Evidence of your trespass." "You have no right," Abigail said, her voice rising with indignation. "I have every right," he said, tucking the notebook into his coat. "And I am warning you." "Boy," he said, turning his cold gaze on Key. "I catch you leading respectable white women into restricted territory again. You will do more than lose your notes. You will lose your freedom. Now get out of my sight." Key's eyes met Abigail's for a fleeting second. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stoic calm. But in their depths, she saw a flicker of something ancient and fierce. He gave a slight nod, turned without a word, and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Sheriff Pike watched him go, then turned back to Abigail. "Like I told you, ma'am," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You keep stirring the mud. You're going to find yourself at the bottom of a very deep, very dark pond." He and Caleb walked off, their laughter echoing in the quiet street. Abigail stood alone, her hands clenched into fists. They had taken her research, her words, her proof. But they could not take what she had learned. They could not take the memory of the wind, the feel of the cool water, or the sight of the lying iron stake. They had meant to intimidate her, to isolate her. Instead, they had given her a new and terrible clarity. They had shown her just how far they were willing to go. And they had shown her that the fight for water was a fight for the very soul of the land. The Six Wells Annual Well Festival was an act of collective defiance against the desert. For one day and one night, the townspeople hung paper lanterns from every awning, roasted a whole steer over a pit of mesquite coals, and set up a fiddler on a platform made of whiskey barrels. They were celebrating the one thing that kept them from turning to dust and blowing away water. It was a loud, frantic, and thirsty celebration, fueled by the very thing it honored. Abigail watched the spectacle unfold from the doorway of her print shop, feeling like a spectator at a play for which she had been unwillingly cast in a leading role. The theft of her notebook had been a declaration of war, and the Well Festival, it seemed, was to be the chosen battlefield. The 6 heroes of 6 Wells were not content with their borrowed glory. Now they sought to conquer the woman who embodied it. The assault began with a fusillade of gunfire. Deputy Caleb Pike, eager to demonstrate his prowess, had set up a line of tin cans on a fence rail. With a theatrical flourish, he drew his Colt and emptied it, each shot sending a can spinning into the air. He was fast and he was accurate, and the crowd applauded his display of controlled violence. He reloaded, walked directly to Abigail, and offered her the still warm pistol. "A woman needs to know how to handle one of these," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I could teach you." His smile was a predator's. It was an offer of power, but the price was submission to his tutelage. "Thank you, Deputy," Abigail said, her own voice clear and calm. "But I prefer to fight my battles with words." She turned away before he could respond, leaving him standing there with his offering of gunpowder and arrogance. Next came Dane Vale, who saw Caleb's failure and chose to counter it with a display of wealth and breeding. He rode his prized black stallion into the main thoroughfare, the horse's coat gleaming like polished jet, its silver-inlaid saddle a testament to the Vale fortune. He put the animal through its paces, a breathtaking dance of power and grace. He then reined in before Abigail, sweeping his hat from his head in a low bow. "A spirited horse for a spirited woman," he declared, his voice ringing with patrician confidence. "He is yours to ride. Miss Moreau, any time you wish." He was offering her a piece of his world, a chance to ride above the common dust. "He is a magnificent animal." "Mr. Vale," Abigail replied, her eyes meeting his directly. "But I am quite content to keep my own 2 feet on the ground." Her second public refusal sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. The town was not accustomed to seeing its most powerful young men so easily dismissed. The nature of the contest then shifted from the physical to the spiritual. Reverend Stone, sensing an opportunity, gathered a flock around the decorated handle of the central well. He did not deliver a formal sermon, but a passionate, impromptu speech about community, duty, and the sacred role of a good woman as the heart of a righteous man's home. His eyes kept finding Abigail in the crowd, his words wrapping around her like a net of pious expectation. Jack Vireo, ever the showman, used sleight of hand. He produced a deck of cards and, with a series of bewildering shuffles and cuts, performed tricks for a laughing group of children. He ended his performance by approaching Abigail, asking her to name a card, and then, with a snap of his fingers, seemingly pulling the Queen of Hearts from behind her ear, he presented it to her with a wink. "The Queen always finds her proper place," he said smoothly. It was a charming, meaningless gesture, and she met it with a polite but distant smile. Ben Hollis's attempt was the quietest and, in its own way, the most honest. He did not perform. He simply walked up to her, his large, calloused hands holding a single, perfect rose he had forged from black iron, its petals delicate and lifelike. He did not speak, merely offered it to her, his eyes filled with a shy, hopeful sincerity. She accepted it with a genuine warmth she had not felt for the others. "It is beautiful. Ben," she said softly, "thank you, but it was the gratitude one gives for a thoughtful gift, not the acceptance of a suitor." Only Dr. Cho seemed to understand the futility of the public spectacle. He found her by the refreshment table, where she had retreated from the relentless attention. He did not offer her a feat of strength or a display of wealth. He offered her a cup of cool lemonade and a quiet conversation about a new medical journal he had received from back east. He spoke to her as an equal, a woman with a mind, and for that, she was truly grateful. Yet, even in his civility, she felt the weight of the town's expectations. He was the most decent of them, but he was still one of the 6. Overwhelmed, she slipped away from the noise and the crowds, retreating to the sanctuary of her shop. The air inside smelled of ink and solitude. She stood before the printing press, her fingers tracing the cold, hard letters of the alphabet in a case of lead type. She looked out the window at the festival, at the 6 men who were, in their own ways, laying siege to her independence. They were all vying for her hand, for the prize of the woman they had supposedly saved. But they were not the heroes of her story. Her hero was the one who was not there, the one who had acted without needing an audience, the one whose kindness needed no signature. An idea, sharp and clear as a well-struck bell, formed in her mind. It was a headline. Her fingers moved with a sudden, sure purpose, plucking the lead letters from their compartments and arranging them in a composing stick. The metal was heavy in her hand, each letter a small piece of a truth only she knew. She worked quickly, the familiar clicks of the type settling into the stick a comforting rhythm. When she was done, she held it up to the lamplight. 6 town heroes vied for her hand. The Navajo warrior's gentle soul truly won her heart instead. It was not a headline she could ever print, not yet, but setting it in type made it real. It was a private declaration of independence, a silent shout against the clamor outside. It was the title of her life. She was still holding the composing stick when a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, her heart leaping. It was Kinatani. He stood on the edge of the lantern light, a still point in the swirling chaos of the festival. He had not come to perform. He had not come to compete. He had simply come. He walked toward her, his eyes taking in the press, the neat stacks of paper, the composing stick in her hand. He did not ask what it said. He did not need to. He stopped before her and held out his hand. Lying in his palm was a ring. It was a simple band of silver, hammered and smoothed, polished to a soft glow. Engraved on its surface was a single, flowing line, a continuous swirling pattern that was unmistakably the image of moving water. "For you," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the distant fiddle music. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. It was cool to the touch, and it fit her finger as if it had been made for her. It was not a jewel to announce a man's wealth or a symbol of ownership. It was a promise, a secret. It was the spring in the canyon, the water of life, a quiet, enduring strength. She could not speak. She simply looked from the ring to his face, her heart full of a feeling for which she had no words. Later, when the festival crowds began to thin and the lanterns began to gutter out, he led her away from the dying fires. They walked in comfortable silence, leaving the sleeping town behind and heading out into the moon-drenched desert. He took her back to the canyon, to the small, hidden spring that the storm had revealed. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and stone. They sat by the small pool of water, the stars above them a brilliant, silent audience. This was their cathedral, their sanctuary. "My husband," she began, her voice soft in the immense quiet. "He was a good man, a professor. He loved books more than anything. His heart was not strong. He saw the world through words on a page. He would not have survived a day out here." Key listened, his gaze fixed on the water. "A man's strength is not always in his arms," he said. He touched a thin, silvery scar that ran along his jawline. "I was a boy when I received this. Not from an enemy in battle. From one of my own people. A man whose heart was twisted with jealousy. He thought to shame me. Instead, he taught me that the deepest wounds do not always leave a mark on the skin." They spoke for hours, sharing the quiet burdens they had carried alone. She told him of her loneliness, of her fear that her husband's quiet world had left her unprepared for this hard land. He told her of the weight of his people's history, of the struggle to hold on to their dignity and their ways in a world that sought to erase them. In the shelter of the canyon, under the watch of the ancient stars, they were not a white woman and a Navajo man. They were simply 2 people who had found in each other a place of quiet understanding. He reached out and gently touched the iron rose she had pinned to her dress. "The blacksmith has a good heart," he observed, without a trace of jealousy. "He does," she agreed. "They are not all bad men, but their hearts are loud." He turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft moonlight. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was light, respectful. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned toward him, meeting him halfway. The kiss was not a fiery conquest. It was as soft and as vital as the water seeping from the rock beside them. It was a sharing of breath, a moment of profound and gentle connection. When they drew apart, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was warm and strong around hers. She looked at their joined hands, then up at his calm, steady eyes, A feeling of peace, so deep and true it felt like coming home, settled over her. "It is your gentle heart," she whispered, the words coming from the deepest part of her. "It is your gentle soul that gives me peace." At that same moment, back in Six Wells, the last of the festival's embers were dying. In the alley behind the saloon, Reverend Stone found Sheriff Pike leaning against the wall, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. "She made a fool of them," the Reverend said, his voice a venomous hiss. "Your boy, the Veil boy. She shamed them in front of the whole town, and then she left with him, the Navajo." "She is a stubborn woman," Pike slurred. "She is more than that," Stone corrected. "She is a disease. She is poisoning this town with her defiance, with her unnatural affections. You saw her notebook. She is a threat to the order of things, to Mr. Veil's plans. You must act. Tonight. Go to her shop. Find a reason. Any reason. Uproot this weed before it chokes us all." The sheriff took a long pull from the bottle, the whiskey hardening the resolve in his eyes. "You are right, Reverend," he said, pushing himself off the wall. "It is time to stir the mud." The peace of the canyon was a fragile thing, a memory that began to fray the moment Abigail and Key reached the outskirts of Six Wells. They had parted ways in the gray light of pre-dawn, with a shared look that spoke more than words. He had gone to his adobe, and she to her shop, the simple silver ring on her finger a silent testament to the bond they had formed. She was lighting the lamp in her shop, the scent of the desert still on her clothes, when the first shouts shattered the morning calm. She ran to the door and looked down the street. A small, ugly knot of men had gathered in front of Key's home. At its center were Sheriff Pike and his son, Caleb. They were dragging Key out into the open, his hands bound roughly behind his back. He was not struggling, but his stillness was a form of defiance that seemed to enrage Caleb, who shoved him forward, causing him to stumble. "What is the meaning of this?" Abigail's voice rang out, sharper than she intended. Sheriff Pike turned, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Official business. Miss Moreau. This man is under arrest for cattle rustling." He pointed to a section of cut barbed wire fence nearby, and a single frightened calf with the Veil brand on its flank, now tied to a post. Cut the wire, was about to make off with Veil livestock. Caught him red-handed. It was a lie, as blatant and poorly constructed as a child's clumsy fabrication. Key, a man who moved with the land, would never be so clumsy. And he had been with her. "That is impossible," she said, walking toward them, her fear now eclipsed by a cold, rising anger. "He could not have been here." "And where was he?" Caleb sneered, his eyes filled with malice. "Out in the canyons with you, an alibi from his sweetheart. That will not hold up in court." They pushed Key down the street toward the small, brick building that served as the town jail. He caught her eye for a single, fleeting moment. There was no fear in his gaze, only a profound and weary sorrow. He knew, as she did, that the truth was not the currency of this transaction. She did not follow them. Hysteria would not help. She needed evidence. Her mind raced back over the scene. The cut wire. A clean cut. She ran to the spot, her heart pounding. The two ends of the wire dangled from the wooden post. She looked closely at the severed tips. It was a single, sharp snip, a pinching motion that had slightly flattened the wire before shearing through it. It was not the clean, angled slice that a sharp knife would have left. She had seen men on the Veil Ranch working on fences, using heavy, long-handled pliers that made just such a cut. She knew she needed someone else, a voice of reason the town might still listen to. She ran to Dr. Cho's office. He was already awake, preparing his morning coffee over a small stove. He listened to her breathless story without interruption, his calm demeanor a steadying anchor in her panic. "The wire cutters," she finished. "I am sure of it. It was not a knife." "An interesting hypothesis," he said, his scientific mind immediately grasping the forensic logic. He took his medical bag. "Let us go and collect the data." They returned to the scene of the crime, The calf was gone. Likely returned to the Vale herd, but the fence remained. The doctor produced a magnifying glass from his bag and examined the cut ends of the wire with meticulous care. "You are correct, Abigail," he said after a long moment, his voice low and certain. "Observe the compression marks on either side of the cut, a knife slices. This wire was crushed and severed simultaneously. This was done with a tool designed for leverage, pliers, or fence cutters. It was proof, real, tangible proof. Armed with this certainty, they marched to the sheriff's office, determined to secure Key's release. The hearing was a farce. It was held not in a proper courtroom, but in the sheriff's cramped office, which smelled of stale tobacco and sweat. A portly, disinterested justice of the peace named Miller, a man known to play poker with Roman Vale every Saturday night, presided from behind the sheriff's desk. Dr. Cho presented their findings with the cool, dispassionate clarity of a medical lecture, explaining the physics of the cut, the difference between a blade and a pincer. Sheriff Pike dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Fancy talk. Doctor, all I know is my son and I found a cut fence, a stolen calf, and him." He jerked a thumb toward Key, who stood silently between two deputies, his hands still bound. "That is all the evidence I need." "It is not evidence. It is a presumption," Abigail argued, her voice trembling with frustration. "You have no proof he made that cut. We have evidence that suggests someone else did." Justice Miller cleared his throat. "The evidence, as presented by law enforcement, is compelling. A man of his background, found at the scene. It is enough for me. I order the prisoner held in jail pending a circuit judge's arrival. Hearing is concluded." He banged a heavy book on the desk, the sound a dull, final thud. It was over. In less than 10 minutes, prejudice had been codified into law. Caleb Pike grinned openly. Shoving Key toward the cell at the back of the office, the heavy iron door clanged shut, a sound of absolute finality. Abigail stumbled out into the harsh morning light, feeling as if the air had been punched from her lungs. Dr. Cho placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "The law is not always the same as justice, Abigail," he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Then what is the point of the truth?" She did not wait for an answer. She walked back to her shop, the doctor's question echoing in her mind. She felt a profound and terrifying silence descending on the town. The silence of fear. The silence of complicity. They had taken her notebook. They had taken her voice in the courtroom. Now they had taken the man whose quiet courage had shown her what it meant to be truly free. She stood before her printing press, her great, silent iron beast. It was the only voice she had left. An angry editorial would be dismissed as the ravings of a scorned woman. A detailed account of the evidence would be ignored, just as it had been in the hearing. She needed to do something else. She needed to fight the silence not with more noise, but with a silence so loud it could not be ignored. She began to set type, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not set a headline. She did not set columns of text. She composed only a single line. Then she locked the frame into the press bed, inked the plate, and laid a clean sheet of newsprint over it. She pulled the heavy lever, the press groaning with the weight of its purpose. She printed one copy, then another, and another, until a tall stack of papers stood on the floor. Each sheet was a vast, empty expanse of white, and at the very bottom, in small, stark letters, was a single question: who profits from silence? That night, long after the last lamp in Six Wells had been extinguished, a lone figure moved through the sleeping streets. Abigail tacked her newspapers to the door of the church, to the wall of the saloon, to the community notice board, to the post of the mercantile. She left a stack at the entrance to the livery and another by the public well. She was a ghost, leaving a message for the living to find in the morning. The dawn broke on a town papered with white flags of inquiry. People gathered in small, confused clusters, reading the single line: their eyes drawn to the unnerving emptiness of the page. It was an accusation that named no one and therefore accused everyone. It held a mirror up to the town's own quiet complicity. "What is the meaning of this?" she heard one man ask another. "The widow has lost her senses," came the reply. But another voice, a woman's, cut in. "Has she? Or is she the only one making any sense at all?" The whispers spread, a countercurrent to the sheriff's official story. The blank page became a canvas onto which people projected their own doubts, their own long-held suspicions about the unchecked power of Roman Vale. The silence had been broken not by a shout, but by a question. Abigail spent the day in her shop, the door locked, watching and waiting. The town was restless, unsettled. She had gambled that a spark of conscience still existed beneath the fear, and now she could only wait to see if it would catch fire. As evening fell, there was a soft, hesitant knock on her back door. She opened it to find Ben Hollis standing in the alley, his massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously around as if he expected to be seen. He did not speak. He simply pushed a rolled-up piece of oilcloth into her hands, his rough fingers briefly brushing against hers. He then gave a short, jerky nod and disappeared back into the shadows, his footsteps heavy and hurried, her hands trembling. Abigail unrolled the cloth on her composing table. It was a map, hand-drawn in charcoal with a draftsman's precise hand. It was not a map of the town or the surrounding territory. It was a diagram of pipes. It showed a complex network of underground conduits, originating far up in the canyons, in the very area designated as Navajo land, bypassing the 6 town wells entirely. The main pipeline, marked with a thick, dark line, led directly to a single, massive cistern hidden on Roman Vale's ranch. Everything clicked into place. The false boundary marker, the pressure on the town's water, the need to discredit and remove Key, a man who knew the land and its secrets better than anyone. It was a conspiracy of breathtaking audacity. Roman Vale was not just controlling the water. He was engaged in a grand act of theft, rerouting the very lifeblood of the desert for his own private use, preparing to let the town and the Navajo wither and die of thirst while he alone prospered. She looked from the damning map to the last copy of her newspaper lying on the table. Who profits from silence? Roman Vale. He profited from the silence of the intimidated, the silence of the bought, and the silence of the law. But Abigail Moreau would not be silent any longer. She now held the key, the truth of the water, the secret heart of the entire conspiracy, and with it, she would not just free one innocent man. She would give a voice back to the entire town. The map was a declaration of war, and Abigail knew they could not afford to lose the first battle. Silence, even the loud, defiant silence of her blank newspaper, was no longer enough. The charcoal lines on the oilcloth demanded action. That night, under a sky bruised with clouds that promised a storm but had not yet delivered, she met with her 2 unlikely allies in the back of Ben Hollis's forge. The air was thick with the smell of coal dust and cooling iron. "It is not enough to know," Abigail said, her voice a low, urgent whisper as she spread the map on a workbench. Dr. Cho leaned in, tracing the path of the pipeline with a clinical finger. Ben stood back, his massive arms crossed, his face a mask of grim reluctance. "We need proof that a court cannot dismiss ledgers, shipping manifests, something with Roman Vale's name on it." "The warehouse," the doctor said, tapping a small square marked on the map, located in a desolate spot a mile from town. "It is the logical place for such records to be kept. It is also the first place they would look for intruders," Ben rumbled, his voice a deep bass of caution. "It is Vale's land. Caleb Pike and his men patrol it. It is a fool's errand." "Perhaps," Abigail conceded, her eyes meeting the big blacksmith's. "But Key is sitting in a cell because of a lie. This town is slowly dying of thirst because of a lie. I would rather be a fool seeking the truth than a wise woman who sits back and allows the lie to win. Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea. The doctor nodded slowly. His decision made, Ben Hollis let out a long, heavy sigh, the sound of a good man being drawn into a fight he did not want but knew he could not avoid. "I will get my tools," he said. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, keeping to the shadows of the rock formations, the rising wind covering the sound of their footsteps. The warehouse was a long, low building, a dark shape against a darker sky. A single lantern burned in a guard shack nearby, but the guard himself was either asleep or seeking shelter from the wind. Ben made short work of the lock on a side door. With a groan of protesting metal, it gave way, and they slipped inside. The air was cool and smelled of pine pitch and raw steel. Crates were stacked to the rafters, long wooden boxes stenciled with the name of a pipe manufacturer in Ohio. It was incriminating, but not definitive. "There must be an office," Dr. Cho whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind now howling around the corners of the building. They found it at the far end, a small room with a sturdy oak door, while Ben stood guard. The doctor knelt before the lock, a set of delicate probes from his medical kit in his hand. With a surgeon's patience and precision, he manipulated the tumblers. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, there was a soft click, and the door swung open. The office was Spartan, a desk, a chair, and a heavy ledger book lying open on the blotter. Abigail lit a small lantern, turning the wick down low. Her eyes flew across the pages, columns of numbers and spidery script detailing payments for freight, for labor, for supplies. And then she founded a large payment to a surveyor, with a note in the margin for relocation of boundary marker, Dry Fork Canyon. Beside it was another entry, a charitable donation to the Six Wells Church, signed and approved by Roman Vale himself. She had just pointed it out to the doctor when a beam of light sliced through the darkness of the main warehouse, pinning them in its glare. "Well, well," Caleb Pike's voice dripped with triumphant venom. "Looks like we caught ourselves some rats in the trap." Behind him, holding a second lantern, was Dane Vale. His expression was not triumphant, but a complex mixture of anger and something that looked almost like disappointment. Ben Hollis moved with a speed that belied his size. Before Caleb could raise his rifle, the blacksmith heaved a nearby stack of empty crates, sending them crashing down in a splintering avalanche that blocked the doorway and plunged the office back into darkness. "Go the back way," Ben roared. They scrambled out a rear window, dropping to the sandy ground outside. The storm had finally broken. Rain, driven by the furious wind, began to fall in cold, hard sheets. They ran, blinded by the rain and the night, toward the only cover they could find, the deep, winding channel of a dry riverbed. Shots rang out behind them, the crack of Caleb's rifle sharp and vicious even over the rising storm. They could hear the thunder of horses' hooves as Caleb and Dane gave chase. They plunged deeper into the arroyo, the steep, sandy banks offering some protection from the gunfire. The rain was a deluge now, a solid wall of water. A strange, low rumble began to vibrate through the ground, a sound that was not thunder. Abigail, her city instincts useless here, barely registered it, but she saw Ben and the doctor exchange a look of pure terror. "Flash flood!" Ben yelled, his voice nearly lost in the roar. The word was barely out of his mouth when a churning, muddy wave, 6 feet high and filled with uprooted trees and debris, came surging around a bend in the arroyo. The dry riverbed had become a raging, lethal torrent in a matter of seconds. Back in the town jail, Ki Nata'ani had been working. Earlier that day, Ben Hollis had brought him a plate of food. As the blacksmith had passed the plate through the bars, something small and metallic had fallen from his sleeve to the floor, a sliver of flattened steel from the forge, unnoticed by the dozing deputy, with the patience of a man who could spend days etching a single line into silver. Ki had spent hours probing the old, rust-pitted lock on his cell door. the rising storm, the distant shouts, the gunshots. They were a clock, ticking down the time he did not have. Just as the roar of the flood reached the town, the lock, with a final, protesting scrape, gave way. He pushed the heavy door open and slipped out into the storm. The floodwaters tore the three allies apart. Ben and Dr. Cho managed to scramble up the steep western bank, but Abigail was caught in the middle of the channel as the ground beneath her feet dissolved. She was swept off her feet, her desperate fingers finding a hold on a small, rocky outcrop that was rapidly shrinking as the water rose around it. On the far bank, Caleb and Dane reined in their horses. Caleb dismounted, raising his rifle. Abigail, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was a perfect target, trapped and helpless. "End this now," he snarled. He took aim, but just as his finger tightened on the trigger, Dane spurred his horse forward, knocking the rifle barrel aside. The shot went wide, whining off into the night. "No," Dane shouted over the roar of the water, his face a pale mask of horror. "My father wants her stopped, not dead, not like this." Caleb stared at him, his face contorted with rage. But it was too late. A new figure had appeared, moving with impossible speed and grace along the crumbling edge of the floodplain. It was Key. He did not fight the raging water. He understood its power, its currents. He launched himself into the torrent at an angle, using its momentum to carry him across the channel. He reached Abigail's precarious perch, grabbed her arm, and with a strength that seemed to come from the earth itself, pulled her into the water with him. "Trust the water," he yelled in her ear. "Do not fight it." He guided her through the churning chaos, using the current to sweep them toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall she would never have seen, an ancient high-water mark that offered the only sanctuary. He pushed her up onto a ledge inside the small cave, then turned back, shouting and pointing, guiding a terrified Ben and Dr. Cho to a safer crossing downstream. The four of them huddled together in the dark, narrow space, shivering with cold and shock, as the brown water raged just a few feet below them. They were alive. They were safe. The storm had saved them and trapped them in equal measure. As the first light of dawn began to filter into the canyon, the floodwaters started to recede, leaving behind a thick, ugly layer of mud and debris. Something was caught in a tangle of roots near the mouth of their cave. It was a leather saddlebag, torn from one of their pursuers' horses in the chaos. Key retrieved it. Inside, soaked but still legible, was a packet of papers wrapped in oilskin. Abigail's hands shook as she unfolded them. One was a formal deed, transferring a parcel of land directly behind the church to a holding company registered in Roman Vale's name. It was signed by Reverend Stone. Another was a letter from the territorial surveyor, confirming the placement of a new boundary marker in Dry Fork Canyon at Mr. Vale's personal request, and thanking him for the generous bonus that had been included with his payment. They had it all. The map had been the key, but this was the confession. The flood, in its terrible, indiscriminate fury, had not only saved their lives, it had washed the truth clean, depositing it right at their feet. They stared at the sodden papers, the undeniable proof of the conspiracy, while the exhausted gurgle of the receding floodwaters echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the canyon. They returned to Six Wells looking like survivors of a shipwreck, caked in mud, clothes torn, faces etched with exhaustion. They were four specters emerging from a storm that had washed the world clean and left its dirtiest secrets exposed in their hands. They did not go to their homes. They gathered in the back of the print shop, the sodden, damning papers spread carefully on the composing stone to dry. Ben Hollis stood guard at the door, his face a thundercloud, while Dr. Cho tended to the cuts and bruises they had all sustained. "This changes nothing here," Abigail said, her voice raspy from the cold and the strain. She touched the signed deed from Reverend Stone. "Pike is the law. Miller is the judge. We could paper the town with these documents and they would call them forgeries and throw us in jail next to Key." "She is right," the doctor agreed. applying a salve to a scrape on Ben's arm. "The disease is localized. We need a physician from outside the infected area." "The telegraph," Key said, his first word since they had found shelter in the canyon. He spoke quietly, but his voice held the weight of absolute certainty. "The wire speaks a faster language than a horse. It speaks to men beyond Vale's reach." The plan was simple, direct, and nearly impossible. The telegraph office was a small wooden shack next to the sheriff's building. It was the town's one true connection to the outside world. A single, vulnerable thread of iron wire stretching across the empty miles to the territorial capital. It was Sunday morning. A false, scrubbed-clean piety had settled over 6 wells. The sound of the church bell, rung by a dutiful acolyte, called the town to worship. It was a summons Abigail and her allies had no intention of answering. They walked together, a small, muddy island of descent, directly to the telegraph office. They were expected. Sheriff Pike and Reverend Stone stood on the porch of the small building, blocking the door. The sheriff's arms were crossed over his chest, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. The Reverend held his Bible like a shield, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "The office is closed," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "Mr. Abernathy, the operator, is feeling unwell, a sudden affliction." "How convenient," Dr. Cho remarked dryly. "Perhaps I should examine him." "That will not be necessary. Doctor," Reverend Stone said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "The man needs rest, not your brand of secular meddling. This is the Lord's day, a day for prayer, not for spreading seditious lies." "The only lies being spread, Reverend, are from your pulpit," Abigail countered, her hand tightening on the packet of papers in her pocket. "We have proof of your arrangement with Roman Vale. We have proof of this whole rotten conspiracy. And we are going to send a message to the district judge in Prescott." A flicker of something fear perhaps crossed the Reverend's face before it was replaced by a look of paternalistic pity. "My child, you are overwrought. The terrors you have endured have clouded your judgment." "My judgment is perfectly clear," she said. "Step aside." The sheriff laughed. "A short, ugly bark. You in what army? Miss Moreau?" As if in answer to his question, a new sound began. It was not the steady, rhythmic toll of the church bell calling people to prayer. It was a frantic, urgent, continuous ringing, a wild, clanging alarm that shattered the Sabbath calm. People began to emerge from their houses, from the saloon, from the church itself, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. A procession was moving up the main street. At its head was a woman Abigail had never seen before, but whose presence commanded an immediate and profound respect. She was an elderly Navajo woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her back straight and proud. She wore a traditional woven blanket, its colors vibrant against the dusty brown of the street. This was Sa'a, an elder whose wisdom was a quiet legend in the territory. Behind her walked a dozen other Navajo women, their expressions calm and resolute, and with them, walking in solidarity, were the wives and daughters of the Mexican shopkeepers and laborers, women who had also lived their lives in the shadow of Roman Vale's power. They did not shout, they did not carry weapons, they simply walked to the church, and a few of the younger women, strong and agile, slipped inside and took hold of the bell rope, adding their strength to the frantic, ceaseless ringing. The town square began to fill. The entire congregation, drawn out by the alarm, now stood blinking in the sunlight, watching the standoff at the telegraph office. Reverend Stone's face had gone pale. The bell of his own church was being used as a weapon against him, a summons to a different kind of judgment. Into this tense, silent theater walked Dr. Cho. He climbed onto the porch of the Mercantile. Holding up a piece of paper, "I have a medical report to share," he announced, his voice carrying in the still air. "As a man of science, I must speak to the facts. I have examined the evidence in the alleged cattle theft for which Ki Nat Anii has been jailed. My findings are conclusive. The wounds on the calf were superficial, consistent with being prodded and pushed, not with being lassoed by an expert roper. Furthermore, the cut on the wire fence could not have been made by his knife. The evidence was manufactured. The man is innocent. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. It was one thing to hear rumors from a distraught woman. It was another to hear a clear, factual declaration from the town's doctor, a man respected for his reason and his integrity. At that moment, a buggy pulled up. Roman Vale at the reins, his son Dane beside him. Vale's face was a thundercloud of fury. He had come to witness the final suppression of the rebellion, not to find the entire town arrayed against him. "What is the meaning of this circus?" he bellowed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "The meaning, Father," Dane said, his own voice quiet but clear, "is that it is over." He stood up in the buggy, turning to face not his father, but the crowd. "I was there last night. I was with Caleb Pike. We chased them. When Miss Moreau was trapped in the flood, Caleb tried to shoot her. I stopped him." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Dr. Cho is right. Key is innocent. This whole thing is a lie." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Roman Vale stared at his son, his face turning a dark, mottled red. The betrayal was absolute, a public severing of the bonds of blood and power. "You are a fool," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You are no son of mine." He raised his riding crop, but before he could strike, a wall of bodies had moved between him and his son. Ben Hollis, Jack Virio, even some of the ranch hands who had served Vale for years, now stood silently, their faces hard, protecting the young man who had finally chosen conscience over inheritance. The balance of power had shifted. The crowd was no longer a collection of fearful individuals. It was a community. Sheriff Pike looked at the sea of determined faces, at the silent, dignified presence of the Navajo women, at the unyielding mass of the blacksmith, and he knew he was beaten. The authority of his badge had evaporated in the heat of the public will. Sa, the Navajo elder, walked slowly forward until she stood before Abigail. She did not speak English. She spoke in her own language, her voice soft but resonant, and placed a hand on Abigail's arm. The gesture needed no translation. It was a blessing, an offering of strength, an acknowledgement of a shared fight. Abigail turned and walked toward the telegraph office. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Reverend Stone, his face ashen, seemed to shrink back into the wall. Sheriff Pike, his bluff called, held her gaze for a moment, then looked away, defeated. He stepped aside. Inside, the telegraph operator, a small, nervous man named Abernathy, looked up from his chair, his face slick with sweat. "Sheriff said," he began, his voice trembling. "The sheriff is no longer giving the orders," Abigail said gently. She handed him a piece of paper on which she had written a short, precise message. "Send this now." Abernathy's fingers flew across the brass key, the staccato clicks and clacks filling the small room. It was the sound of a lock being picked, a door to a larger world being opened. The message flew across the wire, a desperate, hopeful pulse of electricity. Judge Armstrong, Prescott. Conspiracy to defraud citizens of 6 wells of water rights. Evidence of forgery, theft, perjury. Innocent man jailed. Request immediate intervention. Abigail Moreau. 6 wells ledger. When he was done, the room fell silent. All they could do now was wait. The crowd outside remained, a silent, patient vigil. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, impossibly, the telegraph began to chatter back. Abernathy scribbled furiously on a pad of paper. He ripped the sheet off and handed it to Abigail, his hands shaking. She read the words aloud, her voice ringing out in the quiet square. "Message received. Evidence secure. Judge Armstrong will arrive at dawn. Prepare testimony. Clerk of the court." A collective breath was released, a sigh of hope and disbelief. Dawn. Justice was not a distant, abstract concept. It was a rider, on a horse, and it was coming with the morning sun. The ringing of the church bell finally stopped. Its purpose served. In the profound silence that followed, the people of Six Wells looked at each other, no longer as isolated subjects of a cattle baron, but as citizens who had, for the first time, found their collective voice. The promise of dawn is a tenuous thing in the desert. It can bring light, or it can simply reveal the starkness of a landscape where hope is easily swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. For the people of Six Wells, the hours between the telegraph's reply and the sun's first rays were a long, held breath. Justice was coming, but Roman Vale was not a man to wait patiently for his judgment. News travels on the wind in a small town, and the wind that morning carried a message of fear. Vale and a dozen men, hired guns from the look of them, had ridden out. They were not making a stand in town. They had ridden toward Dry Fork, the wide, flat basin where the main artery of his secret pipeline lay buried, the place where the stolen water could be shut off, the evidence destroyed. The town's newfound courage was put to an immediate and brutal test. Fear, a familiar and paralyzing poison, began to seep back into the streets. But the night had changed them. The bell had awakened something that would not be so easily lulled back to sleep. Keep, freed from his cell by a town that no longer recognized the sheriff's authority, became the calm center of the storm. He stood with Abigail, Ben Hollis, and Dr. Cho in the square, the crowd looking to them for direction. "He will break the pipes," Ben said, his voice a low growl. "Destroy the proof before the judge arrives." "We cannot let that happen," Abigail stated, her voice clear and steady. She was no longer just a reporter. She was a participant, her fate woven into the fabric of this fight. "To write against him is suicide," a man in the crowd muttered. "They are armed for a war." "We will not fight a war," Key said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of fear. He spoke not to the crowd, but to the small group of allies around him. He looked at Ben. "I need rope. And your heaviest wrench?" He turned to the doctor. "Is there anything on this land that becomes dust when crushed? Something fine and light." The doctor thought for a moment. "Gypsum. There are deposits of it in the hills east of here. It becomes a fine, slick powder." "Good," Key said. He then looked to the men who had stood with Dane, the ranch hands and shopkeepers. "We will not meet his bullets with our own. We will meet his violence with the land itself. He thinks he owns the earth. We will let the earth fight for us." It was not a speech to rouse a mob to battle. It was a strategy session, a quiet, intelligent plan that offered an alternative to a bloodbath. As a small group of Navajo men and women slipped away to gather the gypsum, and Ben returned to his forge, Dane Vale rode up, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face pale but resolute. "I am riding with you," he said, his eyes finding Abigail's. "I have to face him." The confrontation took place on the sun-baked clay of Dry Fork. The air was still and heavy. Roman Vale and his men were a dark line of mounted figures. Guarding the spot where a massive iron valve wheel, the heart of the entire pipeline, emerged from the ground. They were not destroying it yet. They were waiting, daring the town to challenge them. Vale sat on his stallion, a king on a throne of dust, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. When the small posse from Six Wells appeared on the opposite ridge, he laughed, a harsh, contemptuous sound. They were a pathetic sight, a blacksmith on a draft horse, a doctor, a woman, his own wounded son, and a handful of unarmed townsmen led by a single Navajo. "This is your army," Vale bellowed. "You come to die for a trickle of water." Key did not answer. He gave a low signal, a call like a hawk's cry. In response, a dozen Navajo riders, who had been hidden in the folds of the landscape, emerged on the flanks of Vale's men. They carried no rifles, only long ropes. Their appearance was a shock, a sudden shifting of the tactical board. Then Key urged his horse forward, not in a charge, but at a steady trot. Ben and the others followed, a small, determined wave moving across the basin. "Take them," Vale roared. His hired guns spurred their horses forward, rifles raised, but as they hit the open ground, their mounts began to slip and slide as if on ice. The fine, white gypsum powder, scattered in a wide, invisible arc, sent the horses into a panic. They stumbled, went to their knees, their riders fighting for control. At the same time, the Navajo riders moved in, not with weapons, but with ropes, snagging rifle barrels, pulling men from their saddles with a skill born of a lifetime of herding wild animals. The charge dissolved into chaos and confusion before the first shot could be properly aimed. In the midst of the mayhem, Key's path was clear. He rode directly for the main valve. Ben Hollis was right behind him, the massive wrench tied to his saddle. A few of Vale's men, recovering their footing, turned to intercept them, but the townsmen, emboldened by the success of the trap, moved forward, a human shield, putting their own unarmed bodies in the way. Roman Vale saw what was happening, his plan unraveling into a humiliating farce. He drew his own pistol, his eyes wild, but his target was not the Navajo. It was Ben Hollis, the man with the tool that could undo everything. He fired. The shot went wide as his horse shied on the treacherous ground. Key reached the valve. He leaped from his horse, Ben's wrench in his hand. A heavy iron chain and a massive padlock secured the wheel. He raised the wrench and brought it down with all his strength. The padlock shattered with a sharp crack of protesting metal. He threw the wrench aside and put his hands on the great wheel. It was stiff with rust and disuse. Ben joined him, and together, the two men, the quiet silversmith and the giant blacksmith, put their shoulders into it. With a deep, groaning screech, the wheel began to turn. At first, there was only a hiss, a release of pressure. Then a trickle of water seeped from the base of the pipe. Then the trickle became a gush, and the gush became a roaring, powerful jet of clear, cold water. The stolen life of the canyons, now bursting free, it shot out across the basin, turning the fine dust and the slick gypsum powder into a thick, greedy, sucking mud. The battle was over. The ground itself had become the victor. Horses were bogged down to their bellies. Men, their boots trapped in the thick mire, struggled to move. Roman Vale's army was disarmed, immobilized, defeated by his own stolen prize. Only Caleb Pike, his face a mask of pure hatred, seemed immune to the paralysis. He slogged through the deepening mud, his pistol raised, his eyes fixed on Key. He fired once, twice, the shots wild with rage. Key did not run. He moved with a dancer's grace, using the slippery ground to his advantage, evading the bullets. As Caleb lunged at him, Key sidestepped and, with a flick of his wrist, looped a simple leather thong he had pulled from his belt around Caleb's outstretched arm. He pulled it tight, trapping the gun arm against Caleb's own body, using his opponent's momentum to send him sprawling face first into the mud. Caleb was neutralized without a single blow being struck. The final confrontation was now between a father and his children. Abigail had walked forward, her boots sinking into the mud, until she stood a dozen yards from Roman Vale, her gaze unwavering. He was a broken man, his empire of dust and deceit dissolving into a swamp around him. All his rage, all his failure, focused on the woman who had started it all. He raised his pistol, his hands shaking, and took aim at Abigail. "Father, no." Dane, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, had pushed his way through the crowd. He threw himself in front of Abigail just as the gun fired. The bullet, meant for her heart, struck him in his good shoulder, spinning him around. He collapsed into the mud, a cry of pain torn from his lips. That single act of selfless courage broke the last vestiges of fear in the crowd. They surged forward, a wave of righteous anger, pulling the stunned and horrified Roman Vale from his horse. his pistol lost in the mire. He was surrounded, helpless, a king without a kingdom. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, a new sound was heard, the steady, unhurried clopping of horses' hooves. On the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky, were two riders. One was a tall, stern-looking man with a neatly trimmed beard. The other wore the badge of a territorial marshal. Judge Armstrong had arrived. He rode slowly down into the basin, his eyes taking in the entire, extraordinary scene, the field of mud, the panicked, trapped horses, the disarmed and humiliated hired guns, the wounded son being tended by Dr. Cho, the captured cattle baron held by his own former ranch hands, and the small, determined group of people who had refused to be broken. As the judge reined in his horse, a final, small drama was playing out on the edge of the chaos. Reverend Stone, who had watched the entire debacle unfold, was trying to slip away, to escape the judgment he knew was coming, but his path was blocked by a single, immovable figure. Sa'a, the Navajo elder, stood before him, her face impassive. "Let me pass, old woman," the Reverend hissed, his piety stripped away to reveal the cowardice beneath. Sa'a did not move. She spoke, her voice quiet but carrying with an authority that stopped him cold. She did not speak in English, but everyone there understood her meaning. Ki, his face calm, translated for the judge. "She says," he said, his eyes on the trembling Reverend, "you can run from the sound of the bell. You cannot run from your own conscience." Judge Armstrong dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He looked at the shattered padlock, at the gushing water, at the signed papers Abigail held out to him. His gaze was cold and hard as iron. "Roman Vale," he said, his voice the final, absolute word of the law. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory, all your assets, your land, and your property are hereby impounded, pending a full investigation. Marshal, arrest this man." The balance, which had for so long been tipped in favor of power and greed, had finally, decisively, swung toward the truth. The trial was not held in a building. There was no structure in Six Wells grand enough or clean enough to contain the truth that was about to be laid bare. Instead, Judge Armstrong convened his tribunal in the open square, under the vast, unforgiving blue of the Arizona sky. The sun was the only ceiling, the dust the only floor. The people of the town formed a living wall around the proceedings, their faces grim and expectant. It was a court of sunlight, and there were no shadows in which a lie could hide. Roman Vale and Caleb Pike stood before the judge's makeshift bench, a long table borrowed from the saloon, their hands bound. Vale was unbowed, his eyes burning with a pride that even utter ruin could not extinguish. Caleb was a different story. His swagger had collapsed into a sullen, resentful slouch. In the front row of the spectators sat Reverend Stone, his face pale, a man already judged by the community he had betrayed. The evidence was presented with a slow, deliberate gravity. Ben Hollis, his voice uncharacteristically steady, unrolled the charcoal map on the judge's table, his large finger tracing the path of the secret pipeline. He spoke few words, but the map itself was a thundering confession of grand larceny against the land and its people. Dr. Cho followed, presenting not only his forensic analysis of the faked cattle rustling, but also a precise, scientific report on the town's 6 wells. He demonstrated, with charts and figures, how their water levels had been systematically dropping over the past year, a decline that was unnatural and pointed to a massive, upstream diversion. He spoke of rising sickness rates, of a town being slowly poisoned by a manufactured drought. Then came Dane Vale. His arm was in a clean sling, and he walked with the pained stiffness of a man carrying both a physical and a spiritual wound. He did not look at his father. He looked at the faces in the crowd, at the people he had grown up with, and he spoke the truth. He confessed to his part in the pursuit, his knowledge of his father's plans, and his shame at his own long silence. He spoke of the moment he had seen Caleb take aim at Abigail in the flood, a moment when the choice between a father's approval and a woman's life had become stark and absolute. There was no defiance in his voice, only a deep and sorrowful contrition. Finally, Abigail was called. She presented the waterlogged papers from the saddlebag, the proof of the Reverend's complicity and the surveyor's bribe. Then she presented one final, unexpected piece of evidence. She held up a small, heavy pendant of silver. It was a piece Key had crafted for her the night before, working through the long hours as the town kept vigil. On its face, he had engraved the town's symbol 6 deep wells, their buckets ready to draw life. On the back, he had perfectly replicated the crude, ugly mark from the false iron boundary stake. One is a symbol of community, of life shared, Abigail said, her voice clear and strong. The other is a mark of theft, of life stolen. One was made with patience and respect. The other was driven into the land with greed and deceit. This is the choice that was before 6 wells. It is the choice we have made today. Judge Armstrong looked from the silver in her hand to the hard, unrepentant face of Roman Vale. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unsparing. Roman Vale and Caleb Pike were found guilty of conspiracy, theft of water rights, and attempted murder. They were sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. Reverend Stone was formally defrocked by a letter from the bishop, which had arrived by the morning stage, and was banished from the territory, a man without a flock, without a god, and without a home. As the marshal led the condemned men away, a new conversation began, a quiet but revolutionary murmur that spread through the crowd. They spoke of forming a water cooperative, a council made up of townsfolk, Mexican business owners, and, for the first time, representatives from the Navajo. Sa'a, the elder, was asked to be its first advisor, her ancient knowledge of the land now seen not as primitive, but as essential. Ben Hollis and Dr. Cho were immediately nominated to be the council's first leaders, their integrity now the town's most valued currency. A new order was being born from the ashes of the old. In the midst of this quiet rebirth, a surprising figure stepped forward. It was former Sheriff Pike. He was a broken man, his authority gone, his son lost to him. He approached the judge, his hat held in his hands. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with shame, "I have failed this town. I know that. I am no longer fit to be its sheriff." He paused, and then added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "But I know this land. I know its dangers. If the new council will have me, and if the new sheriff they elect will have me, I would like to ask to stay on, as a deputy, to serve. This time for real." The crowd was silent, stunned. It was an act of humility so profound, so unexpected, that it offered a strange, difficult kind of hope, the idea that even a tarnished soul could seek to be polished clean again. That evening, the oppressive heat of the day finally broke, giving way to a cool, star-filled night. Abigail left the low murmur of the town behind and walked to the riverbank, to a place where a lone, ancient cottonwood tree grew, its leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. Key was waiting for her, leaning against the massive trunk. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, listening to the night sounds, the weight of the day, of all the days before, slowly lifting from their shoulders. The world felt quiet, at peace with itself at last. He turned to her, his face softened by the starlight. His voice, when he spoke, was as simple and true as the silver he worked. "If you want," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "I will stay beside you." It was not a question of marriage in the traditional sense. It was not a claim or a demand. It was an offer of presence, of a shared path, a quiet and profound statement of commitment that honored her freedom as much as his own. A slow smile spread across Abigail's face. She felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling of a lock finally clicking into place. She held up her hand, the silver ring with its flowing water pattern seeming to capture the starlight. She slowly slipped it from her finger and held it out to him. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Then he saw the look in her eyes. "I have already chosen," she said softly, placing the ring back in his palm. It was not a rejection, it was an affirmation. The ring was a promise, and she was returning it to him now not as a symbol, but as a shared truth that no longer needed a physical form. The promise was in her, and in him. He closed his hand around it, then reached out and drew her gently into an embrace. He was not the hero who had pulled her from a fire, and she was not the damsel he had saved. They were two souls who had found their strength not in noise and fury, but in a quiet, shared resilience. He rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. It was a moment of perfect, unspoken understanding, a peace more profound than any victory, a love as quiet and as deep as the water that ran, now freely beneath the desert floor. The seasons turned, and the dust of 6 wells began to settle in a new way. The rage of the flood had receded, and in its wake, the deep, hidden waters of the community had begun to flow freely. The months following the trial were not easy, but they were filled with the sturdy, satisfying work of rebuilding something true. The desert was no less harsh, the sun no less relentless, but the spirit of the town had found its own shade, its own deep wellspring of hope. The 6 Wells Water Cooperative was a testament to this change. It was not a grand enterprise, but a simple, practical one. The main valve at Dry Fork, once a symbol of theft, was now the heart of a shared trust. A council, led by the steady hand of Dr. Cho and the quiet strength of Ben Hollis, managed the distribution. Sa, the Navajo elder, would sit with them once a week, not speaking of pipes or ledgers, but of the long memory of the land, of cycles of drought and rain, her wisdom a vital current in their deliberations. Each family, each ranch, each Navajo hogan received its fair share, a right guaranteed not by law, but by a communal promise. Abigail's print shop had become the town's public square, a place of ink and ideas. The 6 Wells Ledger was no longer just her voice. It was the town's. She had started a new weekly column, a space she called Voices of the Spring. She gave the space over to others. One week, a Mexican shopkeeper wrote of his grandfather's journey from the south. The next, Sa'a's granddaughter, who had learned English at a mission school, transcribed one of the elders' stories about the creation of the sacred mountains. Even the former Sheriff Pike, now a quiet and diligent deputy under a new, elected sheriff, submitted a short, awkward piece about the proper way to track a mountain lion, his first offering to a community he was slowly rejoining. Key's adobe on the edge of town had also transformed. His silverwork was more sought after than ever, but his forge was now a place of learning as much as creation. In the afternoons, he and Dr. Cho held a curious kind of school. Key would teach the town's children, and any adults who cared to listen, how to read the sky for weather, how to find water, how to understand the silent language of the desert. The doctor, in turn, would explain the science behind the lessons, the principles of botany, the geology of the canyons, the way the human body adapted to the heat. It was a partnership of 2 kinds of knowledge, 2 ways of seeing the world, now braided together into a single, strong cord of wisdom. As the air grew crisp and the cottonwood by the river began to turn a brilliant gold, the town prepared once again for the Well Festival. This year, there was no tension, no undercurrent of competition. The preparations were a joyful, communal effort. The paper lanterns were made by the children in Key's class, decorated with pictures of saguaros and hawks. The steer was donated by Dane Vale, who was slowly, painfully, rebuilding his family's ranch on a new foundation of honesty and fair wages. On the morning of the festival, Abigail stood before her press. The air in the shop was cool and smelled of paper and possibility. She took out the composing stick she had kept on her desk. the one holding the headline she had set in type months before. She had never dismantled it. It had been her private reminder of the truth, a silent statement of her heart. Now, it was time to make it public. She locked the frame into the press bed, inked the plate, and began to print the front page of the festival edition. It was not an expose, it was not an accusation, it was a history, a memorial, a shared and hard-won truth. When the papers were distributed that afternoon, people stopped and read the words in a respectful silence. There, in bold black ink, was the headline that told their story. 6 town heroes vied for her hand. The Navajo warrior's gentle soul truly won her heart. Instead, they understood. The 6 men were not mocked. Their story had simply been put in its proper place, a prelude to the real one. The headline was not about one woman's choice. It was about the town's choice, the choice to value quiet integrity over loud bravado, to honor a gentle soul in a hard land. The festival that night was a different creature from the one a year before. The fiddler still played on his platform of barrels, but the music felt lighter, more joyful. The people danced together, their old divisions blurred by the soft glow of the lanterns. Near the fire, a small crowd had gathered, and a ripple of surprised and delighted laughter went through them. Ben Hollis, the massive, silent blacksmith, stood awkwardly, a small book in his huge hands, reading a poem. It was a simple, halting verse about the way iron can be made beautiful by fire, the way a hard thing can be shaped into something graceful. It was his own quiet voice, finally unlocked, and the town listened with an affectionate wonder. Abigail found Key by the river, away from the noise, watching the stars reflect on the slow-moving water. They stood side by side, their shoulders barely touching, a universe of shared experience in the small space between them. The silver ring was gone from her finger, but its promise was a warmth that lived constantly in her heart. "Your headline caused quite a stir," he said, a rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It was the truest thing I have ever printed," she replied. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong around hers. The music from the festival drifted down to them, a sweet, plaintive melody. "Will you dance with me?" he asked. He led her back toward the light, and they joined the swirling circle of dancers. He was not a polished dancer, and she was not a graceful one, but it did not matter. They moved together, their steps finding a simple, easy rhythm. They were surrounded by the life they had helped to heal Dr. Cho, laughing with Sa'a's granddaughter, Dane sharing a quiet word with Ben Hollis, the new sheriff and his deputy sharing a cup of cider. They danced, their hands clasped, their eyes meeting in the warm lantern light. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place. The droughts would come again. The wind would still blow hot and dry. But Abigail knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that they would face it. They would face it together. A community that had learned the desert's most profound lesson. The greatest strength was not in the closed fist, but in the open hand. The most vital resource was not the water buried deep in the earth, but the kindness buried deep in the human heart. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.